And welcome to Hannity. And tonight, a top intelligence official contradicts President Obama's narrative that ISIS, the JV team, is being defeated. Now, earlier today on Capitol Hill, the CIA director, John Brennan, issued a very stern warning about the Islamic State. Here tonight with a full report is our own Catherine Herridge. Catherine.
Sean, the ISIS-inspired massacres in San Bernardino and Orlando show the terror group has brought the fight to America's shores. On Capitol Hill, the CIA director said to expect more.
Our efforts have not reduced the group's terrorism capability and global reach. The resources needed for terrorism are very modest, and the group would have to suffer even heavier losses on territory, manpower, and money for its terrorist capacity to decline significantly.
Despite gains by the U.S.-led coalition, including the reduction of ISIS-held territory and cutting into the group's finances, the CIA director said ISIS is lashing out and seeks to exploit the refugee stream, smuggling routes, and legitimate travel to get trained operatives into Western countries.
To compensate for territorial losses, ISIL will probably rely more on guerrilla tactics, including high-profile attacks outside the territory in Syria and Iraq that it currently holds.
The ISIS affiliate in Libya has expanded, now between 5,000 and 8,000 members, and in West Africa as many as 8,000. Despite a drop in the number of foreign fighters from 25,000 to 22,000 in Iraq and Syria, the CIA director said going after their territory is the most effective strategy.
We need to take away their safe haven because it gives them the opportunity to use these lands to train and to fight. It generates revenue not just to keep their fighters on the battlefield, but also to try to support some of these terrorist operations.
The committee chairman, Richard Burr, seemed to speak for all Americans when he said San Bernardino and Orlando cannot be the new normal, Sean.
All right, Catherine Herridge in Washington tonight, thank you. Now, instead of listening to what John Brennan and other top officials have been warning about ISIS for months, well, the president, he's remaining defiant. Earlier this week, he decided to lecture Republicans about using the term radical Islam. Watch this.
For a while now, the main contribution of some of my friends on the other side of the aisle have made in the fight against ISIL is to criticize this administration and me for not using the phrase radical Islam. This is a political distraction. So there's no magic to the phrase radical Islam. It's a political talking point. It's not a strategy. If we fall into the trap of painting all Muslims with a broad brush and imply that we are at war with an entire religion, then we are doing the terrorist work for them.
Well, Mr. President, they're certainly not the JV team, and they're certainly not contained either. Now, in stark contrast to President Obama, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is not afraid to identify the Islamic threat in the wake of the Orlando terror attack. Let's take a listen.
Radical Islamist terror makes no distinction between shades of infidel. This week it was gays in Orlando. A few days before that it was Jews in Tel Aviv. Before that it was music fans in Paris, travelers in Brussels, Yazidis in Iraq, community workers in San Bernardino, Christians and journalists in Syria. All of us are targets. We will not be terrified into submission. We will fight back, and we will triumph.
Joining us now, the author of Defeating Jihad, The Winnable War, the Distinguished Chair of Military Theory at Marine Corps University, Dr. Sebastian Gorka. You know, this president was wrong almost from the get-go. Wasn't that long ago, a year and a half ago, the JV team, before the Paris attacks, he had just said days before that they were contained, but meanwhile the attacks continue. My question, Dr. Gorka, is this. When the American National Director of Intelligence, James Clapper, the FBI Director, Assistant FBI Director, the House Homeland Security Committee Chairman, the Special Envoy of Obama to defeat ISIS, and now the CIA Director all say that ISIS will infiltrate the refugee population like they did in Paris and Belgium, why would he allow them here? I've been asking this question, and now his own CIA Director recognizes the threat. Why will he gamble with the lives of the American people? Why does Hillary support that?
Sean, I don't think there's a logical answer possible for your question. I think you can only understand what's going on if we reiterate that the president and his coterie at the top level live in a bubble. They manufacture this narrative that there is no such thing as jihadism. Terrorism is a product of poverty and lack of education. And they've locked themselves into that narrative. But it's stunning. John Brennan, the CIA director, used to carry the water for the president. He used to perpetuate this narrative. Something has changed, Sean. He said not only is ISIS still globally capable, later on in his testimony, he said in his 30-plus career, 30-year-plus career, he has never seen the world as unstable. So what does that mean about the last 7.5 years of President Obama and Hillary Clinton's foreign policy?
Let's talk about the linguistic gymnastics that they've been involved in since they took over. I mean, man-caused disasters, workplace violence, overseas contingency operation, our own Department of Homeland Security. They absolutely forbid the use of the terms jihad and Sharia. 94 people have been killed by terrorists since 9/11. They're not dealing with the illegal immigration problem, and we know that more Middle Eastern men are now crossing the border, and yet we've taken in nearly 750,000 migrants from countries that execute gays and lesbians. Is there a conflict of cultures that people are afraid to talk about? In other words, if you grow up under Sharia, you know, and you want to come here, do you want to indoctrinate? Do you want to proselytize? Do you want a theocracy? Or do you want freedom? And how do you determine that?
It's a great question. Remember, Sean, we've got Muslims in our armed forces. We've got patriots. We've got people on the front line in the FBI and the intelligence community. But we've also got people like Faisal Shahzad, the Times Square bomber, a man who came here, became naturalized, worked himself into the middle-class level of American society. And then what does he do? He drives an SUV full of IED materials into Times Square. The question is, what is their value system? Do they agree with the principles of the founding of the Republic?
But how do they share those
Dr.
Gorka, if I grow up and I feel I can tell women how to dress, tell them they can't drive, tell them whether they can go to school or work, they can't leave the house without my permission, you grow up in a system where gays and lesbians are executed just for being who they are. Right. If you grow up under that system and you want to come here, how do we determine you want to change or you want to bring those values with you? I don't know if that's possible.
I think the only way you know that is if the individual, through their behavior, not through what they say, because that doesn't matter. You can only judge a man or a woman on their behavior. If they reject those values, if they grew up in a society that says women are worth less than 50% of a man, do they believe that today? Because if they do, that's a problem.
But an ISIS terrorist is going to lie. They're going to be trained to lie. For example, you know, since Orlando happened this past weekend, 441 Syrian refugees have come to the United States. Since that attack this week, are we playing Russian roulette? Are we risking American lives? Are people likely to die because the president, he says they can vet them, but they didn't do a good job knowing this guy was in the system?
It is Russian roulette, Sean, if we consistently allow the government to shut down those systems that keep us alive and safe. The NYPD knows how to do this. This is what I said in my book. It's human intelligence. It's undercover work. It's surveillance. You've got to find out what that person really believes, and you're not going to do that unless you have people inside the society.
You say we can defeat ISIS. Go back to the semantical gymnastics. I think you have to recognize and identify the enemy for who they are, but what is the best way to defeat them? I'd hate to see a situation where we send young men and women to go fight and they don't even have up-armored Humvees and they're getting their legs blown off and they're knocking on door to door and trying to, you know, weed out where these terrorists are. What is the best way to do it with the least amount of casualties for American servicemen and women?
Three things. Number one, get politics out of the threat assessment. No more censorship, none of this gobbledygook narrative that it's not about jihad and it's not about religion. Jettison that. Number two, you've got to empower the Muslims that are at risk in the region. They are the front line in the war. The Egyptians, the Jordanians, the Sunnis in Iraq that reject ISIS, they must be the face of this war. But that's never going to happen unless we provide the spine, the backbone, the trainers, the ISR, the intelligence, nations. So we have to rebuild all the trust with those nations that Obama has destroyed in the last 7.5 years. And then lastly, the long-term victory comes the same way it came in the Cold War. We've got to delegitimize their narrative, their ideology. We've got to have a giant counter-propaganda campaign with our Muslim allies to destroy the brand of jihad, because jihad is just way too sexy now, Sean. From Brussels to San Bernardino to Orlando to Paris, we've got to destroy it because we are in a war for survival.
Yeah, it's a war of civilizations, a culture conflict. Thank you, sir, for being with us.